How are you? Wonder what happened to you. Hello, how are you? How are you?
Right.
Where's my girlfriend?
Oh, good morning.
Yeah.
Town hall. She's Marja. It's, yeah, we kind of get along.
Well, you know what?
She's,
You know what? Excuse me.
No, I'm fine.
No, I can move.
No, I moved.
why'd you lose?
It's fine. She
Why
came
would
in
I
over.
move?
Thank you. How are you, Grace? I haven't seen you.
I'm good, thank you.
I know Walter doesn't.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. The time is now noon. And so the hour has begun to be fleeting. Because we only have the hour and we have so many choices to make in this hour, so much to discuss about what it means to make a choice. So I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to invite especially those of you who are here, if you would be so kind as to make sure your devices, and more, the devices that are problematic are not the phones, but the watches. It's the watches that make all the noise these days.
I don't know how to turn the watch sound off.
I can show you now or after. What would you like? Come on over. It's really simple.
But Rabbi, I didn't even say hello again.
What's just around?
So you swipe up and then you turn off the ringer.
Thank you.
Just
gonna do that.
Well, these are the Apple watches. These are the good ones. All right. So I'm gonna just start talking. We are in the middle of the 7 weeks of the Omer. What week are we in now?
3.
We're in week 3. Until when?
49 days or over.
No, when does week 4 start?
Sure.
No.
What do you say?
When does week 4 start? This week,
Because we're like 2 days.
Thursday night.
Thursday.
Thursday nights. The days of the Omer happen to fall this year. If you recall from a few weeks ago, first Seder was Wednesday nights. So Wednesday day was the first day of Pesach. Second day of Pesach began Thursday nights. That was the first day of the Omer. So Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday are the 6th and 7th days of week 3. Thursday night, Friday is day one of the 4th week. So this Friday, we will announce that it is turning into 3 weeks and a few days, 2 days of the Omer in the middle of the 4th. Do you follow all that?
Yes.
Starting the 4th week. So we are in the middle of the 3rd week, and the topics of the first 2 weeks were decision and discernment. Now, decision, I think, is interesting because as we look at the scope of what we're doing, the decision that we talked about in week 1 was really the decision to decide, right? The decision to make a decision-making process that includes steps like discernment. I know I need to do something. What are the things that I might want to do? And discernment, which was the topic for last week, was that process. This week, we're going to talk about choice, making the decision, having and feeling the freedom to do that. The word for choice in Hebrew is bachar. Bachar. Bet, chet, resh, bachar. Is that a word that any of you can think of that we refer to from time to time, perhaps on morning services, perhaps before the reading of Torah? So not Baruch. Baruch is bet, resh, kaf, b, ar, chet. This is b, chet, r. So the letters are inverted, and it's actually different letters that make the ch sound, the chaf versus the chet. Now, for non-native speakers, it all sounds the same to me, but one of the beauties of studying Hebrew is that the order of the letters and the 3 letters of the root matters significantly, and whether it's a chet or a chaf matters significantly. But we say, Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, part of the blessing that we offer before the reading of Torah, who chose us, Asher bachar banu, who chose us mikol ha'amim, chose us from among the peoples. So the idea of referring to ourselves as the chosen people, for example, comes from this word bachar, meaning choice in Hebrew. Bechira, choice as well, free choice. However, perhaps the most famous, at least biblical use of the word bachar comes from the book of Deuteronomy. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Uvacharta b'chaim, choose life, if you and your offspring would live. This is at the very end, the very end of the Torah, part of Moses' final speeches to the people. We read from this on Yom Kippur, especially, right? Because so much of the thing of Yom Kippur is about, well, two things: the decisions we've made in the past and the decisions we will make in the future, and the themes of life and death. That notion that we read about both on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in Unatana Tokef, that the decisions we make, the decision to do this or not do that, the decision to make tshuva or not, to offer tefillah or not, to offer tzedakah or not, have an effect on whether we live or whether we die. Who will live and who will die? Who is the speaker in this text from Deuteronomy?
It's Moses.
So I heard two answers. I heard Moses and I heard God. Raise your hand if you think it's Moses. Couple hands. Raise your hand if you think it's God. One hand. Okay, there are like 11 of you in four responses. You can't just sit it out, Philip. You got to put your hand up sometime. Philip, is it Moses or is it God? Steve, I saw your hand go up for God. You're all wrong. It's option C, both and. Because most of Torah, at least when Moses is speaking, it's Moses speaking for God. Of course, Moses is not in a position to set before us life and death. It's God who sets before us. But God can't speak, well, God can speak to us. We can't hear God speaking to us. It's overwhelming. So, except for the Ten Commandments, the words that God shares with us is shared through the intermediary of a prophet like Moses. So I offer this as the beginning, because as our tradition begins to suggest that we have this thing called choice, we have the ability to make decisions for ourselves. What should our North Star be? What is the thing that we should be pointing towards among all other things when it comes to making decisions? So Torah, I think, is our guide, but what does Torah suggest is our destination? I don't see that in this sentence.
You asked what our direction was.
Yeah.
Wasn't thinking of just that sentence. That what it meant. What's the direction?
What does God want from us? Life. Choose life. Choose life. Now, holiness, goodness, all that stuff, follow the words of Torah. That is all, I think, wrapped up in all that. But the Torah is suggesting that ultimately our desire is what? The preservation of life, the pursuit of life, even sometimes at the expense of Torah, right? The notion that we have a pikuach nefesh, of protecting lives, of saving lives, that we are allowed to break Shabbat, for example, this such an important piece of Torah. Why? To choose life. That is the ultimate. It is helpful, I would suggest, to have an ultimate, to have that North Star. Sometimes. I don't think it's ever hurtful, but I would suggest that living our day-to-day lives and our week-to-week lives and our month-to-month lives, that this question is, this is too big. Should I have coffee or tea? That's a choice I have to make. I'm not sure Uvacharta b'chaim is a helpful piece of wisdom in answering the question, should I have coffee or should I have tea? It may help between should I have a Coke or a Diet Coke. But for coffee or tea, it's not so helpful. And so we're going to explore today some things that are lesser than evocative l'chaim, that point ourselves in the direction of choosing life, but give us guidance in the smaller things as well. Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, brought this down several levels. Everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Just as a reminder for anyone who may not be familiar with the story of Viktor Frankl, a man who survived the Holocaust and went on to be and was a brilliant student of the mind and the human condition. It's very powerful for him to say that having lived through an experience where much of his individuality, much of his authority, much of his ability to make decisions for himself had been taken from him, this was the conclusion that he made. That no matter what the circumstance, there is at least one thing left that we have a choice to do. And what is that one thing what is that one choice we have left?
Choose our own attitude.
To choose our own attitude. Carrie, say more about what that means, to choose our own attitude.
Wow. It means to go through life with a chip on your shoulder, or to go through life with an open heart and happiness. It's everything to choose.
I think that.
Our role in society, whether we sit back and do nothing, or we step up and have our voices heard.
So Carrie suggested it's about, some of the big stuff, should we sit and be quiet? Should we raise our voice? Can we be happy? Can we be sad? I think that's all true. But I would also like to suggest that this isn't only about the major decisions that we make. This is also about the mundane. This is also about the day-to-day. Mark, what were you going to add?
Saying that once one's made a choice, it's so freeing. It's like you can relax. It's you made a choice, and you have the purpose, and it's just freeing. It's freeing.
So one element of choosing is freedom, because you're no longer burdened by what? The decision-making process. Now, I wrote last Friday that for some people, making a decision can be difficult, because when they're in the deciding and discernment phase, they are imagining all of the potential possibilities. And they're excited by them. And they're imagining the potential downfalls and what makes them fearful of them. And one of the challenges of making a choice is that you are foreclosing some of that optionality. Right? Well, if we go skiing, it will be cool and refreshing, but I won't be able to sit by the pool. But if we go on a cruise, I'm going to sweat a lot and I might not like that. And if I go skiing, I'll be cool. Those are wonderful things to choose from, but you have to make that decision. That is not what Viktor Frankl was writing about and thinking about as he wrote this. He's talking about the experience of being taken prisoner by the Nazis and living as prisoner in a concentration camp or perhaps even in a death camp. But he suggests even in that circumstance, there's at least something that we have control over, which is what goes on up here in our minds and what goes on in here in our hearts. We can choose to despair. We can choose to fight back. We can choose to be hopeful. We can choose to meet the day with a sense of purpose or not.
The will to live.
With the will to live. Or not. And unfortunately, there were plenty of people who succumbed to the idea that, it's gone. If you read Elie Wiesel, if you read Knight, you hear the stories he told of people throwing themselves on the electrified fence because their will to live had evaporated. And they made the choice to end their lives in that way. Right? An interesting interplay with this idea of to choose life. For them, there was no life. In their minds, there was no life left to choose from. And to live that experience, a life of death, they no longer want. Now that we've opened things up, In the 11th century, Bachi Ibn Bakuda wrote a book called Duties of the Heart, discussing the topics like the unity of God, devotion to God, and repentance, and it's divided into 10 gates. And he offers a reflection on these verses from Deuteronomy to choose life. There are factors that are not beyond our control, namely the choice of service or sin, and intent and resolve to carry out the choice. For these, trusting in God would be a mistake and foolishness, because the Creator left free choice in our hands, whether to serve God or rebel against God. As it is written, life and death I've set before you, and you shall choose life. Okay, what is he saying here? We have the choice between service or sin. Set yourself in the mind of a Jewish leader from 1,000 years ago. What do those words mean in that context? Service and sin.
Slaves.
Judy, hold on 1 second, please.
It seems very clear cut, so there's got to be something else behind it.
So assume it's not clear cut, it's clear cut to you. Tell us what you think. What does service and sin mean to you?
Well, if service is part of life, it's part of who you have to be, and if you don't do that, some sort of service, you sin. I mean, this is the simplicity that I'm.
Okay, so one possible answer is serving others, and to not serve is sinful. Love it. Not sure it's what he meant, but I love it personally. Judy.
Well, I went back more than 1,000 years. I saw service as being not a choice. If you were a slave, we were slaves. Did we have a choice?
So yes, so there's a certain point, and by the way, this is where the Hebrew comes into play. The word for service comes from the 3-letter Hebrew word, ayin, bet, dalet. The word for service in Hebrew is avodah, to work, to labor, to serve others. Hechalutz leman avodah, avodah leman hechalutz, right? Come on, tonight's Yom HaZikaron, tonight's Yom HaTzmaut, we got to sing some kibbutz songs. Service, in the mind of the tradition, is service to whom? To God, to God, in this context, which is different than what you suggested. And I love them both, right? And in the Torah, how did we perform our service? We performed our service through the sacrifices in the temple. That was the methodology of service in Torah. Once we move out of the biblical period and into the rabbinic period, where we're no longer doing the sacrifices, there's a couple of different ways that we serve the Holy One. One is through avodah shebalev, service of the heart, which is a fancy way of saying prayer. Right? Prayer was the way that we replaced the physical elements of service of the ritual sacrifices in the temple on a one-to-one basis. And I would suggest that especially for a text like this, he's talking even more broadly than just prayer, but the idea of performing mitzvot. Doing the things God has told us to do, which include prayer, and includes following the rituals of Shabbat and the festivals, and includes serving other people. Because many of our mitzvot are what we call ben adam lechavero, between a human being and his or her fellow human being. Giving tzedakah, visiting the sick, providing for the wedding couple, going to a funeral, doing the things that make people feel better, especially if they are in need, or celebrating their moments of joy. Margaret.
Could it also be interpreted because we all have different abilities, and maybe it's doing the best you can with what you've got.
Sure.
A person of little intelligence or not with the let them do what they can do.
Yeah.
You have a higher ability and, in other words, doing things that you're not wasting what God actually gave you.
Yeah, I think that that's sort of presumed and implied in our tradition, right? Like, we are given the 613 mitzvot. Who performs all of them? Nobody does. Nobody performs all of them. It's impossible. It's impossible for a lot of reasons. First of all, a good number of them are beyond our ability, right? They have to do with agriculture in the land of Israel, for example, or they have to do with the sacrifices in the temple. We can't do those anymore because of where we live and when we live. But even on the ones that we are able to do, no one is such a tzaddik. No one is so righteous. No one is so capable that they perform all the mitzvot. And no one performs any mitzvah to its fullest. We all do it to a degree. And so, Margaret, your point is well taken. Each of us have different capabilities. What is a better gift of tzedakah? $100 or $1 million?
Depends on the person who's giving
It depends on the person who's giving it. The person who has a net worth of $500, that $100 is a huge amount of tzedakah. The person who has a net worth of $5 billion, $1 million gift is a pittance. So it's very much seen the lens of who are you and what is your service? Absolutely. And all the other things as well. So we had this notion that service, and I think again, in the mind of Ibn Pekuda, the idea of fulfilling of the mitzvot is one half of the binary. What's the other half of the binary? Sin, right? Which we can almost understand as not doing mitzvot. But that has some trappings to it. Because we are all sitting here right now doing mitzvot and not doing mitzvot at the same time. What do I mean by that? Well, many of our mitzvot, 356 of 65 of them, are prohibitions. Negative mitzvot, our tradition says. Things that we're not. Is anybody right now currently engaged in the act of murder? No. So we are all right now fulfilling a mitzvah. Don't murder. I don't see theft going on right now unless you got some kind of computer scheme going on. I only imagine none of us are committing adultery right now as we're sitting here. We are not transgressing the Sabbath. We are not eating chametz on Pesach. All these things that we're not doing are fulfillment of a mitzvah. And we are also not eating the mitzvah. We're not eating matzah right now for Pesach. Why? Because we can't. It's outside of our capability. However, have we all given enough tzedakah this year to have fulfilled that responsibility? No, because there is no enough. So this tension, and I think what I love about this binary that he sets up, which is, I think, a great thing to think about, but not a thing we can fulfill all the time. This dynamic says, if you're not fulfilling a mitzvah, you're doing something wrong, which is an unattainable burden, because it is not possible to fulfill the mitzvah and fulfill mitzvot at all times. We can be doing some mitzvot all the time, but you can't do all the mitzvot all the time. And you can't do all of them at any given time. And you can't do them at all. But this notion that it should be what we should be aiming for. When you have the opportunity to pursue mitzvot, you should. And the notion, and this is kind of a big one, especially for our Reformed community, the notion that if you have the opportunity to fulfill a mitzvah and you don't, he would call that a sin. And the words for sin, we know sometimes there are transgressions, they're missing the mark, and sometimes they're just missed opportunities. And we should do our best to minimize that. We get to make those choices. God doesn't make us do mitzvot. Who makes us do mitzvot? We do. Individually. We make the choice to do it, to not do it. We can all say we have chosen not to engage in a mitzvah for a reason. We've made that choice. It's ours to make. It's ours to make. The intent and resolve to carry it out. Why? Because if we leave it to God, as the second half of this says, then we're not fulfilling the notion that we learned from the book of Deuteronomy. Because God left it to us to make these choices. How do we know that? Because God said, choose life. Not that I am giving you life, you must take it. I am setting before you life, choose it. Choose it. It's yours for the taking. Carry.
So in that context,
Yeah.
life is not just being alive, it's taking action within your.
Yeah, I mean, the verse before, I set before you life and good, death and or life and good and bad, life and death, right? So there's this notion that that life in this context is sort of a stand-in for all life as the ultimate goodness, is a stand-in for all the goodnesses. Pursue the good, right? So even if the decision that is before you isn't a matter of life and death, how can you enhance life? How can you enhance your life? How can you enhance someone else's life? That should be your North Star. That should be what guides you. But it's up to us. It's up to us to make those decisions. It's up to us to be aware of that. It's up to us. God's not going to do it for us. The universe is not going to do it for us. Our mommies are not going to do it for us. We have to do it ourselves.
So if you're, and I don't know if this is possible, that there is a person who doesn't know mitzvah. But if you're a person who sits back and does nothing,
Yeah.
your life is just a life of sin.
To a degree, right? So what we haven't touched on yet, and your question asks us is, okay, what do I get for doing the mitzvot? And what do I not get for not doing the mitzvot? Right? What are the rewards and punishments for living our lives that way? And there are a couple of different answers to that question, right? In the book of Deuteronomy, it makes very clear, if you do the mitzvot, you will be rewarded. If you don't, you will be negatively rewarded. You'll get your just desserts, whether it's in this life or in the next. The theology of Yom Kippur and the High Holy Days suggests that too, right? If there are sins that you perform, you will be judged for those sins, and you will ultimately face your demise for that. And you can head it off by doing things like doing tshuva and doing tzedakah and praying, but ultimately we are judged based on our behaviors, and things will happen as a result of it.
So there's a score sheet.
So maybe, but let me say this. That's one of the ways in which our tradition says this is what happens. That there is a score sheet, there's a scoreboard, and you get points. Like it's like, if anyone ever seen The Good Place, like you get points, and you go to the good place when you get enough points, and you go to the bad place if you don't. That is one theological framework that our tradition suggests. But our tradition is not to be outdone and say there's only one frame. Because another part of our tradition says it actually doesn't work that way. Right? Because that framework doesn't answer the question, why do bad things happen to good people? And why don't bad things happen to bad? So the Deuteronomic theology that suggests do well, get rewarded, do bad, get punished, including you will keep your life if you do well, and you will lose your life if you do bad, it breaks down. It breaks down on the edges. It's all well and good until it stops working. Right? So for example, we lost Harry Belafonte today. He passed away earlier today at the ripe old age of 96. What a mensch, right? There's an example of uvacharta v'chaim. He's a man who brought so much good to so many people in so many different ways. And what did he get? A good long life. And 2 weeks ago, we marked the yard site of Dr. King. Struck down at age 39. How do you reconcile? They both wanted the same thing. They both pursued the same thing. They both came, in certain ways, cut from the same bolt. They worked together at times. They were friendly. Something doesn't make sense.
Someone had muscle.
Had what?
Awesome.
So Margaret says some has mazel, but there is no mazel if we're talking about God making the ultimate decision, right? Because mazel's within it. So this is where this idea that it's a one-to-one connection. You do well, you'll get rewarded. You don't do well, you get punished. That breaks down for most of us.
But we really, as human beings, we really don't know what that reward's potential.
Right.
Or that reward. I
Right.
mean, one believes, I believe that there is a soul goes, out there and it still lives. For some, it's the end, and for others, not.
Right. So to move us forward, yes.
Job,
So what about Job? Say more about Job. What about Job?
Job was a righteous man.
Yeah,
Things before.
right. Right.
So,
So to put a comma, in some ways, we should be motivated to think what I do will lead me to a certain outcome, but don't count on it. Not for the good, not for the bad. It's not a guarantee. The book continues. In a different section. We find, however, in the book of the Torah, a contrary view, namely that a human being's visible acts are in their own power. They can choose them as they please. They are affected by their choice and free will, and they are accordingly liable to reward or punishment for the service and transgression, respectively, as it says, I have set before you this day and good and evil, and choose life. What's interesting about this is it adds a nuance. They are liable for reward or punishment, but it may or may not happen. It may or may not happen. Is there cosmic justice?
Do you know what this is also making me think about?
I'm going to invite you to speak up because I know the folks at home can't hear when you speak quietly into the microphone.
It makes me think about, I do this, unfortunately, waste time. I guess we all do, but it makes me think all the time that's wasted.
Well, the book of Proverbs says a man's folly perverts his way. Through your hands this has come, says Malachi. For according to man's act, God requites him, from Job. At the end, a man's folly perverts his way. Everything in our religious literature, whether it be instruction, precept, or moral exhortation, demonstrates this view. And whatever there is set forth concerning reward for service and punishment for transgression indicates that a human being's acts are left to himself. And the divine glory does not interfere in his prosperity or his ill fortune, in his righteous deeds or his perverse deeds. So this is really complicated. This is trying to say two things at the same time. One thing it's saying is that God does have cosmic justice. We will get our just deserts, whether it's in this life or the next. And by the way, the idea of the next life is the release valve of all the tension. The next life is where we can say, well, Dr. King got struck down early in this life, but he'll be rewarded in the world to come. Oh, this person lived an awful life, was terrible, lived a long life. They'll get their life, they'll get their just desert in the world to come. And don't think for 1 second that because God is deciding what the outcomes are going to be, that God plays any role in the decisions themselves. This strains rationality to a certain degree. That we are completely in control of the decisions that we make, and God is completely in control of the outcomes that come from those decisions. Think about that for a minute. It breaks down because my decision leads to your decision, which leads back to my right. There's an interplay in our free will. And so if God is tinkering with my outcomes, then how do my decisions become free will? Well, that's the fun part. That's the hard part. What do we think?
but in reality, we're just living our lives. We're not thinking about the long-term outcome.
Why not? You should be.
Not because we're getting graded for it, or getting points for it. We're doing it because that's what our will is telling us. hopefully.
So Carrie, you just pointed out something very, I'm gonna reframe it because I think it's really important. The Deuteronomic theology puts a end goal in our behavior. Our end goal is to get the receipts, the reward that we want. That's what's implied by this. What you just suggested is a very, very, very different motivation for why we do what we do. The motivation you suggested as to why a person might be compelled to do the right thing is not to get the reward of having done the right thing, but because it's the right thing to do, irrespective of the results. Did I see a hand over here? No. The folks online have been quite quiet. Anybody have what to add? Judy, Steve, Phil? Phyllis? Philip?
Yes, I'm here.
Anything you want to add, Phyllis?
It's given me a lot to think about, you know. I don't know. I think when I do good things, I think it's because I know God. I feel that it's because God wants me to. I guess I don't usually think. I think the reward for me is that people will think kindly about me. So maybe I am doing it for that reason.
Phyllis, can I put you on the spot for 1 second? Because as I listen to you, it sounds like, and let me just say, this is going to end up casting you in a good light, I think. It sounds like that you're almost struggling to find an external motivation, a reward for the goodnesses. Well, maybe people will think kindly of me. Well, maybe God will like it. And I want to appreciate that, because rather than looking for some external factor, an external benefit from doing the right thing, turn back to the internal benefit or the internal reasoning for doing the right thing. And the internal reasoning for doing the right thing is not because what will come from it, but because it's the right thing to do. It doesn't need an external motivation. It doesn't need a reward. Nita.
Okay, let's assume that maybe there is no God.
Okay, there is no God for one moment.
Then why would one want, if there's no reward, why would one want to live a virtuous life, to do what we call mitzvot?
Yeah.
Why?
So you asked the question, you have to then give us an answer.
Was within ourselves honestly believe that there is a righteous path
Yeah.
and a non-righteous path.
Because in us is an innate sense of the righteous path and not good. Margaret, and I'm gonna respond.
You know, I don't think it matters why you do something. It's the idea that you do it. I mean, listen, there are a lot of people that may be mean, whoever they are, whatever. If they did something good, they gave money to somebody may say, oh, they only did that because they were gonna get this. I don't think it matters why they did it, but they did.
The ends justify the means.
Well, I'm not talking in a negative way.
No, I know. So we're moving into the space of moral philosophy,
So
right?
it says virtuous woman.
Right. So this idea of it doesn't matter. Ours is not to reason why. Ours is but to do or die. Do the good thing or don't do the good thing. That's all that matters. Now, what I want to suggest, I don't know. It's a movie I saw. What I want to suggest is this question is one of the fundamental questions that led to the liberalization of Judaism and the starting of the reform movements. It comes out of the period of the Enlightenment, right? Because up until the Enlightenment, there was only one moral authority. Religion, Bible, God. The reason why we didn't commit murder was because it said in Torah, don't commit murder. But what happened during the Enlightenment, and I think this is best exemplified by Immanuel Kant, is he said there's something else motivating us beyond this external God has told us not to. It's this innate sense of humanity that tells us that murdering is wrong. And how do we know? Well, because we wouldn't want it done to us. And so he says, whatever maxim you are following to choose your behaviors, that should be a maxim that should be universalized. And if your maxim isn't universalized, it's not a good maxim to follow. What does that mean? That which you wouldn't want done to you, don't do to others. Do unto others as you would want done unto you. Those are all different iterations of this idea of the golden rule. Right? The negative one is the Jewish one, right? Don't do unto others, that's Hillel. The more general Western one, do unto others is the golden rule. And then Kant uses word like maxim in German just to confuse everybody, but we know what he meant. So it's no longer just that God tells us not to, but we know, and it comes from us. And so this becomes the big question that we liberal progressive Jews have to answer, which is, now that we have a morality that doesn't necessitate God, what kind of relationship you want to have with God, right? There are plenty of people who live today who are completely atheist and who are moral people, who live much of their lives the same way Jews might. There are places where we may behave differently because we actually do have certain moral barriers that are different. And certainly certain behaviors, right? Not eating matzah, or eating matzah, for example, which someone wouldn't do. But our humanity, and some might say, our God-given humanity, our God-given sense of thought and reason leads us to say, I don't need God to tell me these things. Thank God for that. We can make these choices on our own. Judy, you're chuckling over there.
Well, I think you summed it all up a while ago, Rabbi. It's just the right thing to do. And maybe that's our Jewish upbringing, I don't know. But you know what's right, and you know what's wrong, and you know what's the right thing to do.
Right.
So,
Carrie.
thank you, that's what I've been thinking. So when a 7-year-old does the right thing, not because they're thinking about the reward of God, when I go out and pick tomatoes and bend over because I think it's helping humanity, it's not because God told me to do it, it's because something in here said that's what you're supposed to be doing. And it's not my religious beliefs that are compelling me to do the right thing.
Right.
It's just because somehow my heart has told me this might be the right thing to do today.
Maybe.
Rabbi, this is more like a question, people who do not believe in God and religion, there are a lot of people believe in God, but still, social life, but they don't believe in religion at all. I happen to be married to a Jewish man who is in that thought process, but he's a good man, and he does a lot of right things, and he is thoughtful and I would like to ask, him, because, if, we all here are, obviously we have a common bond, and there is a bigger picture out there, which we hope we are pleasing to our Lord. Maybe not getting something from God back, but just, have I pleased you today? But what do you do when you have somebody like my husband, who absolutely has no belief system like that at all, and he still does a lot of the good things?
Why do we need to do anything? It's wonderful. What's the problem?
Why we do it and so forth, and the reason and everything. So what would be their reason if there's no reward and they don't believe in
Ours
God?
is not the reason why.
Thinking that this is the human nature.
Right.
But there is a reward. You feel good.
Yeah, so part of it is that sense of self.
Yeah, so.
Now, I'm gonna get sacrilegious now for 1 second. And suggest that some of our tradition, certainly much of the rabbinic tradition, maybe even some of the Torah itself, right? Does it come from God or does it come from us? Right? Certainly it is meant to situate us as God speaking to us. And we know, at least among this group of people, right, this synagogue, this community, who takes the wisdom of Kant to heart and suggests that things that should come from us, that's the same group that says, you know what, we see human fingerprints all over the stuff, right? That Torah and tradition is a way, you're gonna love this, is a way for humanity using their God-given reason to take their internal morality and situate it externally in God. Right? I'm a religious person. I believe in God. I believe in some form of creation, and I believe the creation story in the Genesis is a myth. It's an important myth. So I believe that God created us to be, I'm an intelligent design guy in many ways. And I hate that phrase because it has all these political trappings, and I would never want that taught in a public school. But I believe that God is what made the Big Bang go boom. And the Big Bang went boom according to laws of nature that God set forth. And so the fact that I can reason this is a blessing with which I have been bestowed by God. And so I believe that our ancestors thousands of years ago used that reason to figure this stuff out as we're debating it now. And they wrote it down, and it became codified, and it became canonized into this wisdom. And they situated it in the Word of God so that it could bring us all together. I don't think you necessarily need it to be from God to follow it, which is why I have no problem with someone like your husband who follows this without God. I think in some ways he's a stronger character because he can situate all this, he can access all this internally. There are those of us who need it externally as well. And I think most people have a better sense of self than they know. And unfortunately, one of the side effects of situating human reasoning in the Word of God is it opens us up to other people perverting it and usurping the authority of God to teach the things they want to be done. And we see that all across. And our tradition does more than just teach us morality and ethics, right? It builds community. It ties us to our history. There's other reasons to do this as well. Do I care whether the person gives generously because they're motivated by the sense of tzedakah or they're motivated by a sense of responsibility to their fellow human being? No. Just do it.
Well, that's when it's in our Siddur, there's.
Yeah.
From the top or the least to the most.
Tzedakah, yeah, that's 8 runs. My motto is 8 runs of tzedakah. Yeah, giving grudgingly and not enough, all the way up to helping the person help themselves. I want them to go up, but do they do it because God tells them to do it, or because it comes from internal? Does it matter? I don't know. Now, we've been speaking a lot about this idea that we are free to make these choices. You can't talk about choice and free will without at least touching on the major example in our people's history where it didn't exist, or what was taken away. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart. I will then harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt, right? Just as a reminder, Moses and God are talking. God tells Moses to go to Pharaoh, let my people go. And God decides what Pharaoh's reactions are going to be. It's not that Pharaoh's heart hardened, although it says later on, but God declares, I will harden Pharaoh's heart. I will intervene. I will make Pharaoh more stubborn than he otherwise would have been.
To what advantage?
To what advantage? What was the advantage?
To make him have a harder heart? Or why not say, I'm gonna soften his heart so we get this done?
So that's one of the major questions. Why did Pharaoh's heart need to be hardened? The simple answer from my mind is, and this is really not so ethical, is that the signs and wonders were not about convincing Pharaoh of God's authority. It's to convince the Israelites of God's authority. And so God's need to convince the Israelites was done on the backs of the Egyptians. And that hardening of Pharaoh's heart was one step in that process. Not so good,
Okay.
but there it is. Right? So Rashi wonders, well, since he, Pharaoh, behaved wickedly and defied me, God says, and I can see that there is no intention among the nations who serve idols to make a wholehearted attempt to repent, it is better for me that his heart be hardened, so I can increase my signs and my wonders in him, and you will recognize my mighty deeds, and this is according to the measure of the Holy One and Blessed. So it kind of speaks to that, right? God wanted a chance to show off, and Pharaoh was a jerk. So he didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. He didn't deserve my generosity. And so it was morally not reprehensible to punish him and them more because they were terrible people because they committed adultery. There's 11th century, 12th century Judaism. I don't think in our time and place we would feel the same way. But that was one way to look at it. It's hard, right? And this is why, as we experience the story of the Exodus, whether it's when we read it in part of our weekly reading or certainly at Pesach, the plagues are problematic for us. How do we mark the plagues during Seder?
With a drop of blood.
With a drop of
Representing
wine.
blood.
Well, the first one represents blood, and then
Locust.
right? We do one drop of wine for each of the 10 plagues. It just happens to be that wine and blood both look red. Is white wine and new wine. But what is the reasoning behind the ritual, not only of recalling the 10 plagues, but removing a drop of blood, removing a drop of wine from our cup for each one? There's a symbolic importance to that.
Well, for one thing, you're acknowledging that the fact that somebody is getting harmed, so you're diminishing that, or you're asking for some sort of understanding or forgiveness that, we don't want that revenge. We're sorry that somebody.
I think it's to remember the power of God.
Remembering the power of God is why we would recall the plagues in the first place, right? And that leads us to Dayenu. But this unusual act of taking wine out, there's a very physical thing happening. What are we diminishing?
We're diminishing the decree, the very hard, harsh decree that they deserve. But even though they deserve it, God tells us to still have empathy, sympathy. So if we diminish some of that bad stuff.
So I don't think we're diminishing the decree because they're still dead. Right, the firstborn children that the locusts came. What the tradition suggests is this: wine, in particular, represents joy. Wine represents joy. So we are diminishing our joy by 10 drops because of that. That we shouldn't be happy those plagues had to happen. We shouldn't be happy that God felt the need to harden Pharaoh's heart. We shouldn't be happy of what befell the Egyptians. And so we're going to diminish our joy. We're told in Talmud, around the conversations around Pesach in particular, right, that during the time of the temple period, where there's a mitzvah in Deuteronomy, v'samachta b'chagecha, you will rejoice in your festivals. So we have an affirmative commandment to celebrate at Passover. Because we're Jews, we ask the question, well, how do I know if I've done that? What is the behavior I have to perform to fulfill the mitzvah of rejoicing? Judy, I see your hand up. When I finish my long talk, I'll be sure calling. And the rabbi said, well, when the temple stood, the eating of the sacrifice, the Paschal lamb, that fulfilled the mitzvah of rejoicing. But they say, but the temple's been gone for 500 years. And the rabbis say, Ein simcha ela b'yayin. All rejoicing is done through wine. The drinking of the Kiddush wine is the act that fulfills the mitzvah of rejoicing. Why wine? Well, because it says in Psalms, wine gladdens the human heart. And so by physically removing 10 drops of wine from our cup during Seder, we are literally, physically reducing our joy. Not that much, but enough to make a point. Because we struggle with this notion of what happened. Judy.
Well, it's the same with the wedding, with the stepping on the glass. It's also to diminish a little bit of the joy to remember the destruction of the temples.
Yes, that's one of the many reasons why we break the glass. But yes, free will. We got 5 minutes. Free will is granted to all people. Right now, remember, the story of Moses and Pharaoh is situated in the 13th century BCE. Maimonides is writing in the 11th and 12th centuries CE. So we're 2,000 years apart. We've learned some new things. Free will is granted to all people. If one wanted to turn oneself to a good path and be righteous, he has free will. And if one wanted to turn oneself into an evil path and be wicked, he has free will. As it is written in Torah, behold, the man has become like one of us to know good and evil. Right? This is when they ate from the fruit in the garden. That is, this species of human beings is unique in the world. There is no other species like it in this manner. That it knows of its own initiative and will and thought, knows good and evil, and will do whatever it pleases. That there is no one to prevent its hand from doing good or evil, since that is so lest he send his hand. We know right from wrong. We're the only species that does. The other species respond to their needs and their desires, but not the sense of right and wrong. That we can suspend our need and suspend our desire for the sense of right and wrong. Rabbi said in Pirkei Avot, which is the straight path upon man should choose for himself? One which is an honor to the person adopting it, an account of which honor accrues to him from others. And be careful with a light commandment as with a grave one, for you don't know the reward for the fulfillment of the commandments. Also reckon the loss that he may be sustained to the fulfillment of commandments against the reward of doing thereby, and the gain may be obtained by the committing of a transgression against the loss entitled thereby. Apply your mind to these 3 things, and you will not come into the clutches of sin. Know what there is above you, an eye that sees, an ear that hears, and your deeds are written in the book. So is it that we should do it to bring honor to ourselves and others, or because of divine reward and punishment? Which one is it, according to Pirkei Avot? Raise your hand if you think it's divine reward and punishment based on this text. Raise your hand. 1.
Well, it's
Carry louder. It's both. It's both. It's the interpersonal, the internal, human to human, and it's the external. It's both. It's not even either or, it's both and. This now has made the burden even higher. You need to do the things that are in keeping with our tradition's teachings because of the reward you may get for it, and that it brings honor to those you and those around you. And if you can't say that it's both, you maybe shouldn't do it. So this is how Rabbi Kedar described this act of choosing. To choose, to acknowledge, to affirm. Choice is empowerment. We choose to live differently, to be better. With every choice, we defy inertia. With every choice, we become emboldened. But it isn't easy, nor is it linear. We go back and forth between choice and discernment, reaffirming our decisions, re-examining everything. The spiritual path is a zigzag, a switchback up a mountain. It is exhausting, riddled with doubt and setbacks. There are so many ways to get us where we need to go. Last thoughts. Anything from the peanut gallery at home?
That summed it up.
Not actively, just passively.
But I didn't know that.
Okay. You're making the decisions. You get all the credit.
But in Jewish thought, isn't a bit of the light in us? Are we
In-
created in God's image?
Right.
And so, you know,
So we are created in God's image, but this idea of God being in all of us is a more of a Hasidic approach. So not the entire tradition doesn't see it that way. What I will also suggest is there are some parts of tradition who say that we are anything but God, right? So my mind, there's nothing about us that is godly. It's godlike, but not godly. And we can't describe God with any of the attributes that we have, because if we describe God as loving, for example, that description limits the lovingness of God to the depth and breadth of love that the human mind can understand. But God's sense of love is so much farther beyond that, that to say God is loving is putting an inappropriate limit on God. So Maimonides is just the idea of negative theology, which is you can say what God isn't. God isn't vengeful, God isn't bad. But to even ascribe positive attributes to God is an affront, because it's inherently limited by our own sense of capacity and understanding.
when I do something that is it's a backup, you know, a meaningful one, not just putting money in, you know, paper, but I feel, I was a nurse for many years in other professions, and when I was able to, here's the thing, when I had my practice in chiropractic, I always told my patients, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, we're gonna, and one of the patients asked me, Dr. Heyman, no, who's the we? Not a doctor here? And I, you know, I don't mean to sound angelic or anything, but I said, you don't think you're alone, do you? God is. So that's where I get the feeling that there are times when I feel God's presence and I'm going in a direction I need to find out. And I just almost physically, here's the road, I almost, you know, and I follow it blindly and you know.
To go back to Maimonides, who said over and over again that medical science should not be seen as antithetical to or in tension with theology. We should see our human abilities in medical science as an expression of the gifts that God has given us. So when the conversation, for example, a few years ago was happening about vaccines, right? We know that there are some religious groups who say vaccines are human-made, they're therefore not godly. And Maimonides says, no, it's only from the gifts that God has given us that those vaccines came into fruition, and we should see them as therefore of God, not against God. Not everyone listens to us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I forget.